Okay, well, welcome to chapter 17. This is going to do with terrorism, which is we're a tad outside of the kind of classical criminal law, and we're verging more on some political issues. So I ask that the people that are both taking this course and watching this video bear in mind that we're approaching this as much as we can from some of the criminal perspective as opposed from this political perspective, but they are going to bleed over into each other, and we do have to ask some questions, and I'm going to try to remain as unbiased as I can, at least about some historical events and some instances of terrorism, particularly some of the more recent ones that we see in the news. So first and foremost, what are we talking about here? Well, if you think about terrorism as an act of violence, nations all over the world throughout recorded history have been the victims of groups of people who are not government actors but are terrorists, and we'll work more on what that is, who commit acts of violence internally and sometimes externally. So sometimes they're operating inside. This can be sort of international terrorism, and sometimes it can be domestic terrorism. So there have been different attempts, agreements, we call them conventions, to deal with issues that would be, frightening. Nuclear terrorism, the financial construct behind terrorism, the idea of hostage taking, the idea of bombing. And part of the problem here is, since this is a transnational issue when we look at international terrorism, you have international law, but international law lacks the immediate methodology of enforcement that national law has. And by that I mean that if you commit a crime in France, arguably an act of terrorism, and you flee to, say, Italy, the act wasn't, you are now subject to Italy's laws. You're outside of France's immediate national control, and the question is, do these two states cooperate? Do these two states recognize this as a terrorist act? Internally, do you recognize this as a terrorist act? So there's lots of different components floating around here. The UN's goal in all this, which is the transnational goal, is not to identify it as a specific offense, but to start looking at the conduct. What things can and can't you do no matter what? And to make everybody recognize this is wrong. So if we had a convention against nuclear terrorism, you wouldn't say, well, this group, the ABC group, is constructing a nuclear weapon and that's wrong, so we'll go after them. But what you're saying is any group that is constructing a nuclear weapon, other than the national groups that we accept, like the American government, Russian government, Chinese government, any of those governments are not subject to it, but any private group, no matter what their motivation, even if it's a great motivation, is going to be a problem. Okay, so the U.S. definition of terrorist would be violent acts that would also be crimes in the United States that are an attempt to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the government by methodologies of mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So you'll find this, by the way, in Title 18, United States Code, Section 113B. Now, again, the problem is, and I'm going to repeat this quote you're about to hear in a minute, what's the difference between a patriot and a terrorist? At what point does a government become repressive enough that you may operate against it and not accept that you are being defined as a terrorist? In fact, you're defining yourself as a patriot. And of course, any individual can make claim to any title they want. I can claim I'm king of the moon, and I can call myself king of the moon. It doesn't make me the king of the moon. A person can claim they're a patriot. It doesn't make them a patriot. They're just identifying as patriot. You also can label a person as a terrorist. That doesn't make him a terrorist. Patriots tend to be a term that we describe in the positive sense. So a patriot tends to be a term used to describe someone who's fighting against an unjust or despotic government. Terrorists are viewed as people that are acting out of proportion, criminally, I would say, or utilizing methods that are immoral. And this is a distinction, I think, which is interesting. But one of the things that drives me a little crazy is that people say, well, you know, the people that led the American Revolution were terrorists. I don't think so. I don't think using this definition, at least, the American patriots of 1776, the ones George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the rest of them, fit that definition of terrorism. First of all, I don't think they tended to use immoral methods. I don't think their reaction was disproportional. I don't think the methodology of their actions puts them in the terrorist camps. There is, however, a famous quote, and this is one we'll come back to: "Treason doth never prosper. For what reason? For if it prospers, none dare call it treason." All right. The other issue can be, are we talking about a single event, or are we talking about a sustained campaign? Is one act a terrorist act? You get up in a tower with a rifle and start shooting at people, and then you are killed, and you have a political agenda by yourself. Is that terrorism, or does it really require that there were a group of people plotting this, and you were the one that took the rifle, but there were other people involved? And it can be very difficult to distinguish between a single act that we want to name terrorism and a sustained campaign of terrorism. And one of the issues can be, sometimes people will legitimately be fighting against a tyrannical government, because governments can and have historically acted extremely immorally. And two quick examples from the 20th century would, of course, be Nazi Germany, which practiced whole-scale genocide, and the Soviet Union under Stalin, which killed millions of people, or Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China, or the imperial government of Japan from the 1920s through the 1940s. So a sustained oppression sometimes can be far worse or bloodier than any reaction against it. And there's a quote here from Mark Twain, I think, that kind of points this out. There were two reigns of terror. Now he's talking about the French Revolution here. If we would but remember it and consider it. The one wrought in blood and murder and hot passion, the other heartless cold blood. So, think about the reign of terror in the French Revolution. Yes, people were guillotined. But that act lasted a few months, and the other lasted 1,000 years. Yeah, the reign of terror that we think about from 1789, the French Revolution, through the rise of Napoleon, yes, perhaps 10,000 people were killed. But for 1,000 years, the repressive government of royalist France killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And we say, well, that's bad, but we're more focused on the immediate and the momentary terror. Whereas, what is the horror of swift death by axe comparison compared to lifelong death from cold, hunger, insult, cruelty, and heartbreak? At what point do you say it's really bad enough that it is state terror? Okay, so a few things to talk about in the United States. We had revolts prior to the Revolution of 1776. In North Carolina, we had the kind of regulator revolt against the royal government in 1765. After the American Revolution, we had Shays' Rebellion in 1787, which was kind of reaction against debt. We had the Whiskey Rebellion, which is a pretty fascinating event, 1791 to 1794. We had the New Orleans Slave Revolt in 1811, not well documented, I think in part because of the fear. We had Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion, which primarily happened in August 23rd, 1831, although the trial afterwards was longer. We had the anti-rent war in New York, And of course, you could argue the genocidal pacification of the Native Americans was a state-sponsored terrorism. You know, you look at North America in, just take it from the foundation of the American Republic. Let's suppose it's 1783 when we get our formalized independence. You look at the Indian population and Indian land holdings in 1783 in the United States, and you look at them in 2023, 240 odd years later, it's a fraction. And there were intentional attempts to kill the population, and you could say that this is, institutional violence. We then have perhaps one of the ones that Americans are more familiar with, which would be the American Civil War. Prior to the American Civil War, we had a terrorist season of terrorism, I would call it, in Kansas. And not a place we readily associate with Kansas, but it was called in the 1850s Bleeding Kansas, because what was happening was pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces were committing criminal acts against each other outside of the law, sometimes utilizing the law to enforce it, sometimes not. Probably the most famous result was John Brown's massacres in Kansas, although you could talk about the sack of Lawrence, Kansas as well. Even even as late as 1859, we have John Brown leading arguably one of the most famous acts of what you could call terrorism at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And Brown was attempting to incite a slave revolt in the American South. Didn't work out. He is charged with treason against the state of Virginia, and him and 6 other people were hung. And you could say, well, this is terrorism, but you're holding millions of people in slavery. I'm fighting to free those people. Am I a terrorist, or am I some sort of patriot? We have the struggles between labor and capitalism in the United States. From 1860 through 1930, very repressive methods were used by state and local governments to crush attempts to unionize, including using private forces to kill and intimidate oppositions. I'll send you I'll show you a famous picture in a moment. And reactive members could be seen as terrorists. So, this oppression was met with groups like the IWW, the International Workers of the World, which still exists, interestingly enough, called the Wobblies. And they were often accused, and sometimes they did indeed use, at least members of them, terror tactics to fight back against what they saw as this force using against labor. So a good example of this, and again, largely forgotten, but I like to put this in a historical context, is the Battle of Blair Mountain. So there was a strike in the coal mines of Virginia, and eventually 3,000 private strikebreakers, along with the United States Army and the West Virginia National Guard, are brought in to crush the strikers. And they expend up to 1 million rounds of ammunition and kill more than 100 strikers, and including, you'll see there's a air fleet ordered to battle. There were airstrikes called in. So, was it terror to resist the government when you're on strike and they say you can't strike? Is it terror to crush the strikers? Okay. Perhaps the one that I think focuses Americans most readily on this issue, and I know that a lot of this is not necessarily law, and most of this chapter indeed is not, is the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. At the close of the American Civil War, there was an attempt by whites in the South to retain their privileged position over the newly freed slaves, freemen as they were called. And we have the first Klan. And this first Klan was established in 1866 by a man named Nathan Bedford Forrest. And he and his Klan practiced systemic violence, lynchings, burnings, rapings, killing perhaps 3,500 people, terrorizing or injuring tens of thousands. Eventually, this is suppressed by the federal government, but is, kind of goes underground. In 1915, a second Klan is formed. This one is not just against the newly freed slaves, but it basically embraces, of course, this color racism. This race, they would use the pejorative term Negro. They would use other pejorative terms, but they were also against Catholics and Jews, and interestingly enough, liquor, and deeply against public education. They hated public schools. This peaks and fades away by the 1940s, and then by the 1950s and 60s, in part focusing on new threats, desegregation, again, the mixing of the races, communism, Darwinism. We have a new Klan. So these three clans form, come into existence, practice terrorism in the United States. So again, if we look at some early international and national, some of these largely forgotten by people, but if you think about some of the results, the Haymarket Rally Bomb in 1886 killed a lot of people. President McKinley is assassinated by a terrorist, although you could argue he was mentally ill. We have, between 1894 and 1900, 4 European heads of states, including some kings, killed. And arguably the most significant act of terrorism ever committed, I would say, would be, as a single instance, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914, which leads to the First World War, in which millions of people die. Back here in North Carolina, this is a North Carolina course, we have the case of Wilmington, North Carolina. In 1898, Wilmington elected what was called a fusionist ticket. It was a ticket of blacks and whites to run the city of Wilmington and parts of eastern North Carolina, which was much, much more mixed race, and there was a stronger Republican Party. This was seen as a threat to white power. It was also seen as a threat to the Democratic Party institution, and white supremacists staged an armed insurrection against this lawfully elected government. They expelled all these fusionists, both whites and blacks. They killed some. The minimum number they killed was 14. They probably killed more than that, almost certainly killed more than that. But again, the numbers weren't well established. And of course, ironically, the Democratic Post and the papers reported this as a black riot, even though it was white supremacists. Is it terrorism? The famous quote, treason never prospers, for if it prospers, none dare call it treason. I think if violence is successful, we can often forget it, and we can see it as it is simply justified. And then you've got this institutionalized violence, using violence outside of the law to maintain control or to take control. And at the very end of this lecture, we're going to talk somewhat worrisome about the January 6th events. If we look at, and again, we're going to look at Hamas at the very end of this as well, if we look at terrorism as a global problem, we have terrorist attacks. We have attacks in Russia, in Spain, in England, in France, and pretty much after 9/11, this was seen as the major event, and it was really a focus of law enforcement, and police all over the world are on alert. On 9/11, there were about 10,000 attacks across the planet. Of course, 9/11, right? The most significant attacks, there were, in 2011, there were 12,000 people killed. Where were most of them killed? Well, places we don't necessarily associate with terrorism: Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan. Sunni Muslim extremists account for 56% of all attacks, 70% of all fatalities. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates caused 2,000 deaths. The Taliban caused about 2,000. Boko Haram in Nigeria killed about 130. About half these victims are civilians, more than half. 755 are children. So again, What are some of these recent attacks? What are we talking about as far as scope? The 1980s, we have a series of attacks on abortion clinics in the United States. Um, During this decade or so, the 80s and the 90s, about 6 people are killed. In the 1990s, we have the Unabomber. For a 17-year period, he sends out various explosive devices in the U.S. mail, and he kills 3 people and injures 4. In 1994, we have an anthrax attack that kills 5 people. And prior to the 9/11 attack, we have the Oklahoma building, a bombing, where white supremacists, white nationalists, set off a bomb, killing about 168 people and injuring 500 others in Oklahoma City. 2007, we have a planned attack on Fort Dix. 2011, we have a gunman in the Tucson shopping mall. 2013, we have the bombing at the Boston Marathon. 2015, we have a attack on a Navy operations center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. 2015, we've got 2 terrorists attacking an office party, killing 14. 2016, we've got a machete-wielding terrorist attacking people in Columbus restaurant. 2016, again, we have the shootings of the Orlando nightclub. So, okay, I spent a lot of time here. I spent more than 20 minutes talking about the background of this, and I'm going to spend some more time at the end for some of the more recent events. But what do we do on the criminal side? What do we do for charges? Well, obviously you have the regular charges available for you, and that's some of the charges that we talked about, like murder. If you set off a bomb and you kill someone, it might be an act of terrorist, but it also could be a homicide, so you could be charged with murder. You could be charged with assault. So in addition to these charges, however, we have at least 3 other ones to take a look at. One arguably would be treason, an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States by an act of violence. So if a U.S. national was supporting the Taliban and trying to overthrow the U.S. government, that arguably could be treason. Sedition, even if you're not cooperating with a foreign national, see, treason usually you are, not always, but usually trying to overthrow the government. Sedition, you are conspiring to do so. You're forming a group. Sabotage, which can be a crime federally, when you're trying to destroy national defense property. And sabotage was used fairly frequently back in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. Protesters sometimes would break into American military bases. There was a famous case of a nun that broke in and threw blood on planes, and this was arguably sabotage. So we also have terrorism threats, and support of terrorism. Terrorism is a crime that means to create a state of extreme fear, dread, or fright, terror. Prosecutors or prosecutions for making terrorist threats require proof that you made the threat. And the federal government and about half the states have anti-terrorism statutes. And we're going to look at North Carolina's because it's one of the ones I'm more familiar with. So North Carolina has 1410.1, acts of violence and terrorism. Any assault, violence, force, or felony, or threatened use of explosive, incendiary, or nuclear, or biological, or chemical weapon of mass destruction, and terrorism, that is, you intimidate a civilian population at large, the whole civilian, or group, or influence intimidation, the conduct or activities of the U.S. or any state or local government, it makes it a crime. And it essentially is an aggravating factor. So you can tack this on to, okay, you killed someone, we'll tack this on as an aggravated factor, we'll bump up your punishment. It also allows for the seizure of personal properties and treble damages. You can demand more money. So let's suppose you had a group that in North Carolina was a white supremacist group that was threatening the Center for Rural Poverty or something, I don't know. And it turned out that you could identify this group, we'll call them the Sheetheads. And you identify the Sheetheads as a terrorist group in North Carolina. You could sue them, and let's suppose they owned a building where they had their little meetings, and the building was worth $10,000. Well, you could seize that property, You could also, as the Center for Southern Poverty, you could sue them, and you could say, well, you know, you damaged our office and you caused $5,000 worth of damage, so you owe us 3 times that. You owe us $15,000, and you could wind up, and this has happened historically, where targets of terrorist groups have wound up owning the assets of those terrorist groups. Now, terrorist groups need, if they're going to get big enough, financial support. So the US government has various criminal laws aimed at addressing the financing of terrorism. So these laws target things like, are you engaging in transactions with foreign nations that support terrorism? So are you giving money to North Korea, to Iran, to the United States? Congress or the executive department can designate countries that support terrorism. So two that had traditionally been, Libya's kind of a mess now, but would be Iran. Also, you could say this organization is a terrorist organization. And are you giving material support, including donations to them? And sometimes these lines get kind of gray. Suppose you have, right now there's a civil war in Sudan. Suppose you have an organization in Sudan which is feeding hungry people. And you might say, well, okay, you know, they're out in front of the grocery store asking for donations. I'll give them money because I don't want people to starve. But it turns out that they're only feeding the group that is using terror against people. They are feeding them, they're not buying bombs from them, but you are effectively supporting that group. So it can be things like not just giving money, but lodging, training, safe houses, false documents, communication equipment, weapons, lethal substances, explosives, or transportation. And you can see how this is kind of a gradation where you start off at the very base and move on. So in the early 21st century, there was right around 800 prosecutions for this, 804. And most of these prosecutions are going to be for support of terrorism. And we're really looking at criminal charges for, a lot of this is financial. Now, again, where does this money come from? 9/11 stated that between $400,000 and $500,000 that was used to finance the 9/11 attacks, the ones that brought down the tower, crashed the plane in Pennsylvania, crashed the plane into the Pentagon, came from charitable organizations, which then funneled that money to them. Now, one of the things that you can do if you want to control a terrorist organization is cut off their access to money. And very often they will turn around then and they will enter into criminal activities. Famously, Joseph Stalin, one of the worst dictators of the 20th century, robbed banks under Tsarist Russia. You've got terrorist groups like the Shining Path down in South America that are in bed with drug trafficking because there's money there. Theft, bank robberies like Stalin, fraud, intellectual property crimes. Stopping the flow of money to terrorists is very difficult because charity is one thing, you know, helping people that are starving, but what happens when some of that money, like a 9/11, is diverted? Large quantity of funds move in and out of the United States every day, both legally and illegally. Money transferred, of course, and money or precious property, gold, for example, can be done by human courier or electronically. Web pages can be used. Funds can be transferred using informal value transfer systems. Al-Qaeda cells use something called the Hawala system. And this has been deemed to violate U.S. money laundering laws and anti-terrorism. So again, we have attempted to, particularly for the Muslim terrorists that the United States is dealing with outside of the United States, deal with it financially. Now, there can be some international criticism of this. Post 9/11, the United States did some questionable acts in its war against terrorism. For example, under both U.S. law and laws, transnational laws, those laws I talked about early on about the United Nations, makes it illegal to torture people. Well, what's torture? Under a U.S. program called Extraordinary Rendition, people that were suspected of terrorists were tracked down, by U.S. agents, and those would include U.S. nationals, CIA, NSA, but also people working for the United States, foreign intelligence agencies that were cooperating with this, and they would grab people and take them to other countries for interrogation. And those countries don't have guidelines like we do. And so the critics would say, well, you are indirectly sponsoring torture. And supporters say, well, these are the best places to do it. It's legal in those places, therefore what we're doing is not legal. And one of the questions becomes, can you grab people in the United States and get them outside of the regular judicial system? And the answer seems to be yes. You should read a case called Padilla versus Rumsfeld, where a U.S. citizen is taken, I guess is the best word, on U.S. soil, and he is held first in a Navy brig and later transported outside of the jurisdiction of the United States and held for quite a period of time because he's simply labeled a terrorist. Now, was he or wasn't he? I'm not going to get into debate, but again, you've got some constitutional issues there. Can you simply go over to the dark side, as Dick Cheney would say, in order to fight this? So some of this is this extraordinary rendition. You kidnap or capture a person, depending how you want to use the term, suspected of some crime. You transport them to a country where they can use torture. Egypt, Syria, Uzbekistan, Yemen were all used. Between 2001, 9/11, and 2005, about 150 people were taken and subject to this. And the question is, okay, is it a crime, and what do you do with them, and are they part of the criminal justice system? All right, so I want to close, and you can see a lot of this is really not per se criminal law. We're dealing mainly with political, and so we're going to go into the minefield of the January 6th attack. Okay, so I tried to make this as neutral as I can. I even hesitated to use the word attack, but on January 6, 2021, we have you can call it attack, you can call it a riot, you can call it a coup, you can call it, and part of that, whatever identification you get is going to lead you to certain conclusions. So you can just say the January 6th event. Okay, so I think this is a really good example of interpretation, because some groups will say what the people did were legitimate, and other groups will say no, they're illegal. And then I think the question we're addressing, at least in this chapter, is, does any of this fit the definition of terrorism? So we have some agreed upon facts here. The event lasted approximately 5 hours. The Capitol was entered unlawfully by a group that was protesting. About 174 people to date, and we're in 2024 now, have been arrested. And the property damage for repair and increased security ran around $30 million. Now, it gets contentious. Do we add people that were injured? Do you want to talk about the one person that was shot breaking in? She died. Do you want to talk about police officers who later committed suicide or from PTSD from the events, the terrorist, the events that happened to them? Do you include those as deaths? I mean, I didn't include the bun because I don't think it's an agreed upon fact. So I guess the next question, since this is a unit on terrorism, is, are we dealing with a terrorist idea here? No single group is in charge, and this is very common. If you go back to that, I said the most famous terrorist attack was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Okay, you have the Black Hand, which was a pro-Serbian terrorist group, but you also had the Serbian secret police involved. So you had no single group directing everything. So no single group was in charge or led the attack. You had groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the QAnon movement, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and people that were unaffiliated or were in one or both groups who were dropped in and out. Whatever kind of agreed upon goal here was, they wanted to disrupt or delay the counting of the Electoral College. And you had an election. The election had selected electors, which gave Congress the duty to count those ballots to select the president. So the people protesting claimed that the election was illegal or fraudulent, and thus they were acting not against, but in support of the Constitution, or so they claimed. Now, to be honest about it, there's very little real evidence that can be brought forward in a court of law that there was any significant fraud. I know people disagree with this statement. I'm trying to equivocate here quite a bit. I'll just say there's little evidence to support it. So what were these people charged with? Because after all, let's bring this back to the criminal law. Well, most were charged with trespass or some form of illegal entry. But a few were charged with that seditious conspiracy charge, where you were attempting to do things. And some people that could be identified were charged with worse things. So if we take, for example, one of the police officers that was guarding the Capitol, police officer Michael Fenelon, was pulled out of the line where he was trying to stop people by a mob. He was beaten with pipes. He was stunned with a taser. He was pepper sprayed. He suffered traumatic brain injuries and PTSD. Okay, so you've got people that let's take the most positive aspect, claiming they're not terrorists. You got people that had entered the Capitol. Somebody grabbed this guy. Somebody pulled him out. Somebody beat him. He is a cop. He didn't use access. He didn't shoot anybody. You can't claim that no action he took triggered it. So at some point you have to say, can't you charge people who broke in with this? And how far does that go? Do you just charge the immediate people? Do you charge people that plan this when it gets out of control? And then the argument is, again, is this terror? Is this terrorism? All right, the final point that I'll talk about, and this is a shorter lecture than usual, really, because there's not a lot of law here to talk about. It's mainly this background that your book gets into. And this is not in your book. This is the problem in Hamas and Gaza. So on October 7th, 2023, Hamas invaded Israel. They came across the border from the Palestinian enclave of Gaza, and they took hostages. The Israelis responded. They didn't just take hostages away. Let me back up, because I guess I could have put far more there. They committed acts of violence. They committed acts of murder. They committed sexual assaults. They did quite a few things. And okay, so you've got a quasi-state, the Palestinian enclave, as I'm calling it, of Gaza. I guess you could call it a nation state in some way, shape, or form. I don't think it fits a lot of that, because it doesn't have a lot of international recognition in a certain sense. Israel responds by invading. So their total death, if we're going to keep count, is about 1,400. A lot of those are servicemen, a lot of those are these hostages, a lot of these are people involved. Conversely, the total Palestinian death to date, and we are in May of 2024, is you have, I would say, an interesting dichotomy, a split between the result of state violence, which is war, killing 30,000, and the result of what you could fairly classify, I think, as a terrorist act by Hamas of 1,400. And you have, arguably, a disproportionate response. So I'll leave it with this. I'll leave it for you all to discuss. Does the methodology of response, the methodology of action matter? If we say, yes, what Hamas did was terrorist, does that allow anyone responding to it to do pretty much whatever they need to stop this in the future? And what methodologies are acceptable, and when do we start falling into, if that we go back to that slide with Mark Twain, when do we start going back to that old terror, that kind of institutional terror? And that's a question for you all to answer. It's certainly not a question the law can answer easy. All the law can do is you can make a law and you can enforce a law. Making the law is the issue. and then applying that law is the issue. So I will leave it at that in about 40 minutes or so. And whenever you're ready, we'll move on. We're moving out of what I would say is somewhat suspect, but I would say interesting aspect of the criminal law. Other than that, you all have a happy morning, afternoon, evening. Whenever you listen to this, fare thee well.